Today I'm going to show you how to multiply decimals less than 1 with base 10 blocks. With decimals, the base 10 blocks represent different place values. The square represents hundredths, the rod represents tenths, and the flat represents ones. So let's model the decimal 11 tenths. 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths, 6 tenths, 7 tenths, 8 tenths, 9 tenths, 10 tenths, and 11 tenths. In second grade, when we were adding base 10 blocks, every time we made a 10, we traded up. So let's look at our model for 11 tenths. Can we make a 10 and trade up? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have 10 tenths, so I'm going to go ahead and trade that up for 1 flat. Next, I'm just going to slide the extra tenth left over, and now we're ready to write a decimal for 11 tenths. I notice I have 0 squares, which represents 0 hundredths. I have 1 rod, which represents 1 tenth, and I have 1 flat, which represents 1. So the decimal form for 11 tenths is 1.10. Let's model the expression 5 tenths times 3 tenths. Remember, the first factor represents the number of groups, which is 5 tenths. The second factor represents the size of the group, which is 3 tenths. So we're going to start by modeling the size of the group. 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths. Now we're going to look at the number of groups. I don't want the whole tenth, I actually want less than 1. I want 5 tenths of the tenth. So what does that look like? I'm going to go ahead and use the squares to model 5 tenths of a tenth. 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths, 5 tenths. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for the rest of the 2 tenths. Now that we've completed our model for the expression 5 tenths times 3 tenths, I'm going to focus on those yellow squares and see if I can make a 10 and trade up. I'm going to go ahead and count 10 of those squares, and I'm going to circle them and trade them up for 1 rod. Next, I'm just going to go ahead and slide over the leftover yellow squares since they are less than 10. And now we're ready to write the decimal for the product of 5 tenths times 3 tenths. I notice that there are 5 yellow squares, which represents 5 hundredths. There's 1 rod, which represents 1 tenth. And there's 0 flats, which represent 0 ones. So the product of 5 tenths times 3 tenths is equal to 0.15. Here's another example for multiplying decimals with base 10 blocks. Let's take a look at the expression 7 tenths times 4 tenths. Again, I want to start with the size of the group, which is 4 tenths. 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3 tenths, 4 tenths. Next, I'm going to look at the number of groups. I notice that 7 tenths is less than 1 whole tenth, so I'm only going to fill part of each tenth. 1 tenth, 2 tenths, 3/10, 4/10, 5/10, 6/10, 7/10. I'm going to do the same for the other 3/10. Now that I have completed the model for the expression 7/10 times 4/10, let's take a look at those yellow squares to see if I can make a 10 and trade up. I'm going to go ahead and count 10 yellow squares. I'm going to circle them and trade them up for 1 rod. I'm going to go ahead and look and see, can I make another group of 10? I'm going to circle my second group of 10 and trade those up for another rod. And now I have less than 10 squares, so I'm just going to slide those leftover yellow squares. And now I will be ready to write my decimal. So taking a look at my new model, I notice that I have 8 yellow squares, which represents 800s. I notice 2 rods, which represents 2/10. And I notice I have 0 flats, which represents 0 ones. So the product of the expression 7/10 times 4/10 is equal to 0.28. And that is how you multiply decimals less than 1 with base 10 blocks.